Welcome to the Speaking Your Lingo podcast, where my goal is to help this generation think well. My name is Shane Lingo, and you are listening to part 3 of a series that I am calling Should I Become a Pacifist? Leo Tolstoy versus C.S. Lewis. If you haven't done so already, I want to encourage you to go back and to listen to part 2 of this series, where I spoke about the pacifist side of the argument and Leo Tolstoy's thoughts on why we should all become pacifists. Today, I'm looking forward to our conversation on the non-pacifist side of the argument through the eyes of C.S. Lewis. Now, before we get there, I want to answer a question I've gotten from a few listeners, which is, Shane, when are you going to share your thoughts and your opinions on the question of pacifism? And to answer that question, it's coming up in the next episode. That's what the 4th and final episode is going to be all about, where I actually land on the topic and how I answer the question of should I become a pacifist? So you're not going to want to miss that one, so stay tuned for that conversation. But in order to understand my argument, we first need to understand both of these great men's arguments from the past. So we focused on Tolstoy on the last episode, and I'm excited to be diving into C.S. Lewis's thoughts today. And I think it's important as we start this episode to remind us what Speaking Your Lingo is all about. It's all about this idea of helping this generation think well. And in order to do that, we have to be able to do 3 important things. And these are 3 important things that I was able to share on the very first episode. First, we have to understand why we believe what we believe. In other words, we have to be able to understand our own worldview, why we think what we think, and what reasoning and logic we use to get there. Second, we need to understand and listen to the ideas from other people's worldviews. And especially people that we disagree with. We need to be able to wrestle with their ideas and to ultimately, in light of what we think and what we believe, understand why we ultimately disagree with those ideas. And thirdly, we need to be able to communicate all of these things in a rational and a loving way. And so hopefully this series is helping you to be able to do all of these things when it comes to the topic of pacifism. But without further ado, let's talk about the man, the myth, the legend himself, C.S. Lewis. One could argue that C.S. Lewis was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. In his lifetime, he wrote many great books, including The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, and dozens more. And really, I could probably do a whole series talking about Lewis and the impact he's had on the world. And also not only just the world, but I could say me personally as well. And maybe I will, do that in a future episode. But for today's conversation, we're going to be narrowing in and looking at him in the context of our topic of pacifism. The thing about Lewis, as was true of Tolstoy, is that Lewis was no stranger to violence and warfare himself. He actually fought in World War I. And in fact, he was actually in the frontline trenches on his 19th birthday on November 26th of 1970. And this was in France. And so Lewis experienced firsthand one of the most horrific wars the world has ever seen. At one point in the Great War, Lewis lost 2 of his best friends. On another occasion, Lewis sustained 3 shrapnel wounds that ultimately kept him off the battlefield throughout the war. And at the age of 40, Lewis was also in support of assisting in England's World War II effort. At the start of World War II, he actually tried to become an instructor of cadets, but his offer was ultimately declined. During the Second World War, he also gave multiple talks to the Royal Air Force. He wrote some of his most famous works and recorded his BBC talks that would later become Mere Christianity. So, as can be seen by his support and involvement of both world wars, Lewis, although a Christian, was by no means a pacifist. And sometime in 1940, Lewis gave this talk that he entitled, Why I Am Not a Pacifist, to this pacifist society at Oxford. And he gave this talk that he had, this talk or a manuscript of it, to George Sayer. And eventually, George Sayer gave that to be published by Walter Hooper in the book The Weight of Glory and Other Addresses. And so if you've ever read that book, you have most likely read this talk that Lewis gave to this pacifist society on why he was not a pacifist. And in this talk, Lewis carefully expresses his arguments and his views on pacifism and non-resistance. So that is one of the places that I'm going to be drawing from in order to understand Lewis's views on this topic today. And the reason I've chosen C.S. Lewis for the non-pacifist side of the argument is really due to the richness of his insights on the topic, both theologically and philosophically. And if you've ever read any C.S. Lewis, you know that he had this true gift for really tying faith and reason together, which is one of the reasons that his books have probably sold millions and millions of copies over the years. So, as to be expected, Lewis's approach to this challenge of pacifism is very systematic and it's very logical. And my goal in this episode is to draw out those arguments in such a way that you as the listener will be able to see that beautiful combination of faith and logic as he wrestled with this complex issue. And just as I said in the last episode, although I may agree with Lewis on many different topics and ideas, it doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with all of his ideas when it comes to the topic of pacifism. So just like I did with Tolstoy, my goal in this episode would really to be able to share these arguments in a way to persuade you as the listener of these ideas, whether I agree with them or not. And then again, on that final episode, you'll get to ultimately see where I land. So Lewis starts his talk, Why I Am Not a Pacifist, with a simple and clarifying statement, which I think is a great place for us to start today. He says, the question is whether to serve in the wars at the command of the civil society to which we belong is a wicked action, or an action morally indifferent, or an action morally obligatory. In other words, Lewis points out that the question of whether or not one should become should serve their own country in a war is ultimately this question of morality. It's either something we ought to do, something we ought not do, or something that makes no moral difference at all. It's really one of those three options. So what do we do with this important question of moral judgment that Lewis raises? And according to Lewis, every moral judgment involves four key factors. Those four key factors are facts, intuition, reasoning, and regard for authority. And you could also add a fifth, which Lewis kind of does, which is checking your own passion for the subject. How passionate am I for the subject? And is my passion and my emotions maybe getting in the way of my logic when it comes to the issue? And then Lewis takes each of these four criteria, facts, intuition, reasoning, and authority, and he applies them to a statement. And that statement is this: it is immoral to obey when the civil society of which I am a member commands me to serve in the wars. And Lewis does this in order to show whether or not this statement is ultimately justified in light of these four criteria. So let's look briefly at these four criteria and how they apply to the discussion of morality in war. And we're going to be spending most of our time on intuition and authority, which is mainly where Lewis's and Tolstoy arguments actually meet on this issue. So let's start with the facts. When speaking about the facts and certainty, it's important to know, and Lewis brings up this point, that in the realm of moral certainty, we're not looking for the same confidence that we would find in mathematics. Lewis points out that the kind of certainty in most cases when it comes to morality and such is not going to be found in the same way that you would find it in a subject like mathematics. With that said, where do we find these facts that we're looking for when it comes to the discussion of war and moral judgment? Lewis would say that the facts come from experience and authority. And since we only have limited experience, the majority of our facts usually come from authority. Now, the one fact that both sides, including Tolstoy, would agree on is that war is overall disagreeable. And I think almost everyone listening would agree on that point. We can all agree that war is overall disagreeable. The majority of people on both sides of the debate don't like the idea of war. I mean, most of us see it as a tragedy overall, even if we think a particular war is ultimately for a good cause or ultimately a just war. War is just tragic, and no one likes to see war. No one likes to be a part of a war. And I know I'm using kind of these definitives that no one does, but the majority of people would agree on that stance, that war is just overall disagreeable. Lewis states, the main contention urged as fact by pacifists would be that wars always do more harm than good, and or wars do no good. But the question this brings up is is it true that wars always do more harm than good? Like, can we agree with that? Do you agree with that, that wars always do more harm than good? And so Lewis points out many of us can think of a counterexample to that argument as we reflect on different wars throughout history. So from the Greeks to the Romans, we think about Europe's involvement in World War I. One could easily argue either way. You could argue on either side. So that's not necessarily a fact, even if the majority of pacifists, according to Lewis, agree on that fact. And Lewis would add in his own words, he states, "It seems to me that history is full of useful wars as well as useless wars." So we see both in history. We see wars that are good and ultimately lead to good things, and we see wars that do the opposite. They just lead to destruction and chaos and are ultimately useless. And so with that said, overall, these ideas are merely speculative, and you can't really convince someone either way is essentially the point that Lewis is trying to get at. And this is why Lewis concludes, and he states, that wars do no good is then so far from being a fact that it hardly ranks as a historical opinion. And so obviously Lewis thinks very little of this perspective, and he points out that it's really not a fact, but it barely makes a historical opinion. Now, let's move on to this idea of intuition. And we have to answer the question first, what is intuition? And it's a fairly common word that we use, but it's always important to clarify what we mean when we use terms like this. And so here's what Lewis describes as intuition. He states, "There is the direct, simple act of the mind perceiving self-evident truth as when we see if A and B both equal C. Then they equal each other. This act I call intuition." So in other words, intuition is something that is self-evident, right? Meaning it's something that doesn't need to be demonstrated or explained. It's something that is ultimately obvious to us. For example, the truth of mathematics can often be seen or thought of as self-evident. 2 + 2 = 4. A second example is one's belief in their own consciousness, right? Both of these examples assume certain propositions that need little evidence to show that they correspond to reality, that they line up or make sense with the way things really are. And so according to Lewis, when it comes to the reality of war, the relevant intuition seems to be that love is good and hatred is bad, or helping is good and harming is bad. So this seems to be the natural conclusion. And it would seem that on both sides, the pacifists and the non-pacifists would both agree on this. They would both be in agreement with that intuition. And again, that intuition is this. The relevant intuition seems to be that love is good and hatred is bad. We can all get on board with that, right? And helping is good and harming is bad. And that seems right. But Lewis then goes on to paint a picture of how this intuition becomes a lot more complicated in reality. He gives an example that sometimes reality can mean one's friend A is in trouble at the same time as stranger B. Okay? So we have friend A, he's in trouble, and we have stranger B, and he's in trouble. And if they're both drowning, one might pull friend A on board at the expense of stranger B. You can't save both. You have to choose, and you're probably going to choose friend A over stranger B. And then this kind of goes even further. If stranger B is causing some sort of harm to friend A, sooner or later involves helping A by actually doing some degree of violence to stranger B. So in this scenario that Lewis gives, if one decides to do nothing, it would seem to disobey this intuition. You must help one over the other, and Lewis concludes, certainly no one's conscience tells him to help B, the guilty. The only option then is to help A. So there's this idea of intuition that would lead us to really have to preserve or help friend A at the expense of friend B. And then once harm is being done, intuition would tell us to naturally step in and to protect friend A at the expense of stranger B. But then Lewis goes on to takes this idea even further by applying it to nations as a whole. The only way to ultimately restrain an army or a nation from harming another one is really by war. And I think that's most likely true, right? How else do we, stop a nation from war? Now, there are some other things. It's not that war should be the first step by any means when settling disputes between nations. And I think we know that, especially in our modern world. When tactics such as diplomacy don't work, though, and sanctions don't work, it seems like war is the only option to stop another nation from trying to get its way over another nation, to stop a destructive nation or a harmful nation from getting what it wants. How else do you do it besides warfare, right? And that's the point that Lewis is bringing up. The war seems sometimes like it really is the only good option to stop that harm from being done. And intuition would lead us on an individual, on a personal level, to protecting our friends, but also as a nation, it would lead us into protecting our own nation. Now, one might ask, but shouldn't one try to make everyone in everyone's country a pacifist? In other words, shouldn't I try to convert everyone in my country to pacifism? And to this idea, Lewis responds this way. He says this: then you have handed over the state, which does tolerate pacifists, to its totalitarian neighbor who does not. Pacifism of this kind is taking the straight road to a world in which there will be no pacifists. Okay, so Lewis's point is, if your entire nation turns pacifist, what is stopping your totalitarian neighbor from taking over? Really, there's not much, right? If you have a whole nation full of pacifists, no violence, no warfare, and we were to just sit back and do nothing, it would be so easy for these larger countries, I think of these larger communist countries, right, to be able to take over and essentially have their way with these other pacifist countries. What would really be stopping them? Again, you can go back to World War II and think about Nazi Germany and the dictatorship and totalitarian government. Think of fascism, right? What was stopping Hitler? Nothing but war. He would have kept going. And then imagine if he was able to gain more power. And then again, back to the side of thinking some of these communist countries and their ability to wage war and nothing getting in the way and nothing stopping them. I mean, what would that world look like? Certainly not a world that I would want to live in. Well, before we look at our last and arguably most important criteria, it's time for our quote of the day. As always, as I read it, guess who said it? War must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. Take a moment, think about it. Guess who said it? If you said Faramir from J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, or J.R.R. Tolkien himself, you are correct. In the Lord of the Rings series, Faramir is a mighty warrior who leads his men bravely into battle, and yet he tells Frodo this line. Let me read it again. War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. In other words, what Faramir is saying and what J.R.R. Tolkien is ultimately saying through him is that I don't value war for the sake of war. I don't value fighting for the same reasons that others might value fighting, right? But I do love what I'm defending. I love what's behind me. I love what I am protecting. And in order to protect what I love, I ultimately have to go to war. And I have to be able to defend what I care about. In other words, war is necessary. Violence is necessary in order to protect the things that I love. Now, Tolkien once wrote that Faramir is the character that is most like Tolkien himself, which is interesting when you start to read these words and think about what's being said here. And when it comes to J.R.R. Tolkien, a little bit about Tolkien, Tolkien completed his studies at Oxford in June of 1915, And similar to Lewis, he actually served in World War I. And what makes Tolkien interesting for our conversation today is that Lewis and Tolkien were very close friends. And although they had many disagreements, if you read about their relationship, they had many of these disagreements between one another throughout their friendship. Tolkien had a huge impact on Lewis's faith. And there's a lot of great stuff out there that you can read up on their friendship and their relationship through the years. One book, if you're interested in C.S. Lewis's life and their friendship and some of these other things, is called Jack, A Life of C.S. Lewis by George Sayer. And there's a lot of great stuff in there. It's a great biography. And I got to read it this past year and really enjoyed it. And so if you're looking for kind of a great biography on the life of C.S. Lewis that includes some of these elements that we're talking about today, that is a great book to look to. Now, getting back to our main topic, it's time to focus on authority. And this is really, again, where Tolstoy and Lewis's arguments meet. This is really where we're going to be able to compare these different ideas between these two men. So in the last section of Lewis's talk, he turns his attention towards authority. And for most Christians, this is really where the rubber meets the road for them as well. This is the point where they're looking to in order to answer this question of, should I become a pacifist? According to Lewis, authority can be split into two main different categories. There's human authority, and then there is divine authority. An example of human authority is the authority one's own country has over them. So when you think about your country, they have a certain level of authority over you, right? And they are essentially in charge. Now, I know that's complicated if you're listening here and you're from America, right? Because of the sense that we have this idea of popular sovereignty, and it's a country and a government that is by the people and for the people, and the power mostly resides with the people. But thinking about Lewis's time and what he's speaking to, there is a sense where your country has a certain level of authority over you. And as Lewis points out, if one is looking for authority from their own country, most countries are actually in favor of a non-pacifist position. In other words, they are okay with some level of violence in order to use their military to protect one's own country. And Tolstoy seemed to get that sense as well. He actually seemed to agree with Lewis on this point. And this is one of the reasons that Tolstoy actually denounces government altogether. When you start to read a lot of Tolstoy, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the last episode, but he kind of leans towards anarchism with his views as far as he takes them in the reality to essentially denounce one's government altogether. Now, with that said, both Tolstoy and Lewis recognize that human authority is ultimately not the final say. And we essentially have to go further than this human authority. We can't just look to man's subjective opinion on questions of morality. Even if it's a group of men, that, I guess from both of these men's perspective, right? And I would tend to agree with this. There's not really a justification for morality if we're not looking to something outside of ourselves or something higher than ourselves. Then morality just becomes this subjective thing that we can change on a whim based off of how we feel or how a group of people might feel. And so in order for there to be an authority on this issue, it has to be grounded in something outside of ourselves. And so that's why Lewis turns the attention towards what he calls God's divine authority. And so the question becomes for the Christian, and this was the same for Tolstoy, and this is the same for Lewis, is what did Jesus have to say concerning the issue of non-resistance? And so we looked last week at how Tolstoy helped to answer that question, but today we're going to look at that and see how Lewis answers that question. And again, this is where Lewis and Tolstoy's arguments are essentially going to come to a head. So that's where we're going to spend the majority of this talk, is considering this question of divine authority. So looking to the New Testament, Lewis points out that really there's not much to be said concerning pacifism in the epistles. Some pacifists have pointed to the Apostle Paul's thoughts in Romans chapter 12, in which really Paul is echoing Jesus' words found in the Sermon on the Mount. And they point to this as evidence for the pacifist position, but beyond there's not really much to be found, although there is some. That being said, Lewis points out, and I quote, When we turn to Christianity, we find pacifism based almost exclusively on certain of the sayings of our Lord Jesus himself. So in other words, if one wants to find out what the Bible has to say about non-resistance, one should look to the words of Jesus found in the Gospels. And again, that is where we found Tolstoy's argument. Lewis notes, it would be in vain to try to base your conclusions or my conclusions of Christianity on some general idea. If anything, that would point towards kind of this non-pacifist position. So he makes the point, and he says it this way: the whole Christian case for pacifism rests, therefore, on certain demonical utterances such as resist not evil, but whoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. So Lewis recognizes and essentially goes to the same place that Tolstoy went to in the Gospels of Matthew 5 and the Sermon on the Mount. And so that's where we're going to turn our focus. And I want to read that passage again. It says this: "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil. But whoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 39. Now, to the Christian who says that this passage should be taken without any qualifications and just taken straightforward, similar to how Tolstoy takes it, Lewis is quick to point out that such a Christian should also take all of the other sayings of Jesus in the same way. That if we're going to take this with this just straightforward, simple, and literal interpretation, then we need to do that with all of the passages of Jesus found in the New Testament. And that might be overstating it a little bit, but essentially he's kind of begging the question, why would we essentially take this passage with this simple and literal interpretation when we're talking about this idea of resist not evil? And so what Lewis ends up doing is he goes on to explain that there are three ways of interpreting this passage, resist not evil. And so I want to go through each of these different interpretations real quickly, and then we'll settle and talk about really the third one. But first, the first interpretation is the interpretation we spent all of the last episode talking about. The passage essentially means what it says, and it imposes a duty of non-resistance on all men in all circumstances. This is the pacifist interpretation. And this description, again, would match Tolstoy's simple and literal interpretation of the words. So for the pacifists, to use violence, again, in any and all situation is in opposition to Jesus' words. That's how they would understand this passage. That is reading it with this simple and literal, straightforward interpretation. And as Lewis calls it, he calls this the pacifist interpretation. Then there's a second interpretation that Lewis calls the minimizing interpretation. Lewis describes it this way: it does not mean what it says, but is merely an orientally hyperbolical way of saying that you should put up with a lot and be placable. So for the minimizer, Jesus' words are essentially, according to Lewis, an overstatement or an exaggeration, really just meant to encourage people to be as gentle and forgiving as possible. But ultimately, Lewis doesn't actually give much credit to this view and assumed his listeners wouldn't either. And he believed that the real challenge had to do between the first view that he gave, the pacifist view, and a third view, which we'll go into right now. So he doesn't really give much credit to this minimizing interpretation. And he moves on to this third view, which he didn't really give a name to it, but I like to call this the contextual interpretation. And ultimately, this is Lewis's own interpretation. The interpretation would say this, and this is, again, Lewis's words: the text means exactly what it says, but with an understood reservation in favor of those obviously exceptional cases, which every hearer would naturally assume to be exceptions without being told. So, although Jesus meant what he said simply in regard to injuries that are committed to me by my neighbor and my desire to retaliate, we must not, to use some of Lewis's words, confound what is true absolutely with what is true under certain circumstances and limitations. And so Lewis would say, if the critical factors are an injury caused to me by my neighbor, and just my desire to retaliate, then Jesus would say to that to essentially denounce that desire. Don't act out in revenge. And I think Lewis says this idea beautifully. He says it this way: no quarter whatever is given to the voice within us which says, he's done it to me, so I'll do the same to him. So Lewis would say that this passage is speaking to a heart essentially of revenge. There's nothing in us that should respond in violence to someone in order to essentially just try to seek and get revenge on them because of some deep-seated anger or hurt or desire to cause pain out of that hate comes out of us. He says that's what this passage is speaking to, that we're not supposed to act or respond in this way. And yet he would argue that the listeners listening that day would assume other reasons that you would be able to essentially act out and respond, like the examples that we gave, whether it's, again, protecting your neighbor from harm or even just trying to defend and protect yourself from harm, or trying to protect your country from harm. In other words, the average listener listening that day to Jesus's words wouldn't have been thinking about war. They wouldn't have war on their minds. And so, according to Lewis, what Jesus meant by his words was clearly understood by his original audience. And essentially, that's if you are angered due to violence against you, control yourself and don't strike back. If you're trying to respond again in anger or retaliation, don't strike back, right? If you're trying to get revenge, this is not about revenge. Don't attack, right? That's what this passage is speaking to. Now, some examples that Lewis gives of factors where one might actually have grounds to resort to some level of violence in the context of this passage is if, for example, first, if a homicidal maniac is trying to murder someone, are we just supposed to stand aside and allow him to get his victim, right? Like, are we supposed to just step aside and say, oh, sorry, I am essentially a pacifist. I'm not allowed to step in and use any sort of violence to protect anyone. And then second, he says, should parents who have a child with a temper allow that child to hit them every time they get upset? Or do they have to use some level of force in order to stop and to raise that child in a way where they teach them that, hey, it's not okay to hit adults, and it's also not okay to try to hit or seriously harm other children, right? And so you might have to step in and stop that. He also gives another example of essentially a teacher that's hit by a student or a soldier who's struck by their enemy. And he says it this way. He says, in those situations, your duty may be very different. Different because there may be then other motives than egotistic retaliation for hitting back. And so in these situations, there's the importance of what is the motive that you're trying to respond with. Now, I don't think that Lewis is arguing that you can't have bad motivations or think you have a good motivation and still do bad things, but this passage really is speaking about retaliating or responding in some sort of level of anger or malice towards your neighbor because you're trying to seek revenge against them. And so Lewis goes on and he fleshes out this idea even more. But really, good exegesis is imperative when we're studying the words of Jesus in the New Testament. And so Lewis makes the point by saying it this way: any saying is to be taken in the sense it would naturally have been born in the time and place of utterance. In other words, what Lewis is saying is we need to do our best to understand Jesus' words in their original historical context. Hence why I essentially call this the contextual interpretation. So essentially we're asking the question, and Lewis is asking the question, how would Jesus' original audience understood his words? And it's not likely that Jesus was referring to war in any of these statements. And I think even Tolstoy would probably agree with that. And he even says that essentially Jesus doesn't mention war. And then we went over that in the last episode, why Tolstoy believes he doesn't speak to it. So on both sides agree that this statement isn't speaking to war. And so as far as how the original audience would have received the message, it is more likely that his audience would have been thinking about personal conflicts amongst villagers. In other words, Jesus wasn't speaking about war, and his audience wouldn't have thought about war, but they would have thought about their everyday lives and the conflicts that they would have had amongst each other in their small villages, right? Or even, you could say, large villages. And so to bring this to a larger biblical context, Lewis also raises a challenge of how to reconcile some other pacifist interpretations. And so some of the other passages that Lewis brings up that he feels are problematic for a pacifist are Romans 13:4 and 1 Peter 2:15. And in these two passages, we see that the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter approve of the magistrate's use of force in their epistles. And with that said, according to Lewis, it does not seem that the passages found in Matthew or the broader biblical context really give any credibility to the pacifist position. And so he adds this in his own words: any theory which bases itself on a supposed historical Jesus to be dug out of the Gospels and then set up in opposition to Christian teaching is suspect. That position, essentially what Lewis is saying, puts too much weight on the theory for which there's little evidence for. And so you have these three different interpretations that Lewis gives. Again, you have the pacifist interpretation, you have the minimizing interpretation, and then you have Lewis's own interpretation, which I call the contextual interpretation. And Lewis essentially is saying that if you take into account the historical context and what his original audience would have heard, you can assume that he wasn't talking about war, and you can assume that they heard him focusing on this idea of not responding out of anger, not responding out of revenge to your neighbor, but responding out of love. And so to take this with a simple and literal interpretation, according to Lewis, would be taking this too far, and essentially it's not what his original audience would have heard. And so as we wrap up today and we have these three different types of interpretation on our minds, as was true of Tolstoy, I would say that there's much that can be said concerning Lewis's views on pacifism. And for some, this hopefully is just the beginning of the conversation, and maybe you'll go back and you'll read Lewis's words in his talk, Why I'm Not a Pacifist. And hopefully this episode will help you in that reading. And because, as some have found, reading Lewis isn't the easiest read necessarily. And so maybe this could be a resource as you go back to try to read his words and what he was communicating concerning pacifism in these three different views. But overall, Lewis concludes that as long as there's no reason to think that your passion is getting in the way, by using reason to process through these three things, facts, intuition, and authority, it will most likely lead you to a non-pacifist position. And so I've done my best in this episode to break down Lewis's views and to organize them in a compelling way for you. Hopefully, it's given you as much to wrestle with as it has for me. And whether you agree or disagree with Lewis's arguments, I hope that this episode has challenged you to think well about this topic of pacifism. Now, again, next up for this series, it's going to be part 4, and I'm going to be sharing my own views on how I answer the question of, should I become a pacifist? And so I want to encourage you to stay tuned for that. If you haven't done so already, make sure to follow this podcast so you catch that next episode, as well as share this podcast with your friends and have these conversations. And I would love for you to comment, send me a message, send me an email, and to be able to hear your thoughts and how those conversations are going. Other than that, again, I want to say thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.